Early 1960s London. The city felt like a volcano on the verge of eruption. On one side, the rising sound of the Beatles, on the other, the restless cry of youth searching for freedom. Fashion, however, was still locked in the shadows of aristocratic gowns and stiff traditions on the runways of Paris and London. Women walked with heavy makeup, sculpted hair, and the posture of untouchable statues. That was the female image of the era, powerful but cold, glamorous but unreachable. And then, onto the scene stepped a young woman, Jean Shrimpton. Her arrival was quiet yet devastating, a revolution. Clothed in simplicity, Jean was unlike any model. Before her, there was an innocence in her face, an effortless ease in her movements. She looked so natural that people watching her didn't feel as though they were staring at a goddess on a pedestal, but rather at someone they might meet on the street. Yet this very naturalness, this uncalculated authenticity, was almost a crime in the eyes of the fashion elite. They demanded grandeur, extravagance, distance. Zhang brought none of that. Loose hair, minimal makeup, plain clothing. Critics mocked her at first, too ordinary. That face has no place in fashion. But what they dismissed as ordinary was about to transform into extraordinary power. Her story began in those crowded London studios during those early runway moments, when no one realized a tectonic shift was about to shake the fashion world. The 1960s were a decade of rebellion. Women were growing tired of corsets, conventions, and suffocating expectations. Jean Shrimpton became the living image of that rebellion. Yet before she could become a symbol, she had to collide with every wall the industry had built. The first cracks were forming. Jean's background was humble. She hadn't grown up surrounded by wealth or glamour. She came from the English countryside. From a modest family. There were no glittering ballrooms, no grand catwalks in her childhood perhaps. That is why she never lost her naturalness when the spotlight turned toward her. Even in front of photographers, she didn't pose theatrically. She simply existed, with a kind of raw honesty. Her smile wasn't manufactured, her expressions weren't rehearsed, and that was exactly what set her apart. While other models looked like characters playing a part, Zhang looked like reality itself, that reality unsettled the fashion establishment. In her early shows, designers whispered doubts. Too simple, she never last. But the audience thought differently. There was something magnetic in her simplicity when her face appeared in magazines. Young women across Britain saw themselves reflected in her for the first time. Fashion felt accessible, and that accessibility was nothing less than revolutionary. Zhang herself, at that time, had no idea what she was unleashing to her. It was just a job: walk the runway, show up for shoots, follow instructions. But with each step, she was quietly dismantling an empire built on elitism. Up until then, models were defined by their distance from ordinary people. Jean Shrimpton embodied the opposite. She was the voice of youth, the face of a generation that didn't want to be dictated to anymore. By her early 20s, she was already challenging the foundations of a world that had ruled women's bodies for decades. This chapter captures only the beginning, the first collision, the whispers, the tension. The explosion has not yet come, the peak is still ahead. But the threat can be felt. A system is trembling. Jean Shrimpton has stepped onto the stage, and whether the world wants it or not, change is inevitable. The moment Jean Shrimpton began to appear more frequently in London studios, whispers in the fashion industry grew louder. Photographers who were tired of stiff, lifeless images suddenly found in her a kind of living electricity. She didn't pose. She existed. She didn't construct expressions. She let them flow. David Bailey, a young photographer just beginning to carve his own reputation, recognized something in Zhang that others could not see. When he placed her in front of the camera, the chemistry was undeniable. He didn't have to instruct her to tilt her head at impossible angles or force her into rigid lines. Zhang simply looked, moved, and breathed, and the lens devoured her authenticity. Soon, Bailey and Shrimpton became inseparable, both professionally and personally. And together they created the aesthetic that would later be called the swinging 60s. What they were producing was not just photography. It was cultural disruption. While Vogue editors clung to their Parisian muses, Bailey insisted on bringing Zhang into the frame again and again. In those pictures, the world began to glimpse a new archetype. Gone were the towering, distant divas. Here was a young woman whose loose hair spilled freely across her shoulders, whose minimal makeup revealed more humanity than artifice, whose eyes spoke of vulnerability and strength at once. When those images began to circulate, young people felt seen. They looked at Jean and thought, "She looks like us." That connection was explosive for decades. Fashion had been dictating from above, commanding how women should appear suddenly. Jean made fashion feel like something you could live inside rather than admire from a museum. Yet this democratization was exactly what frightened the establishment. Designers muttered behind closed doors, "She is ruining the craft." Editors whispered, "She lacks discipline." But the more they criticized, the more the public adored her. By 1962, Jean Shrimpton's face was becoming unavoidable. Magazines that once refused her now featured her on covers. Each photograph ignited discussion, not because it was polished, but because it was raw. Bailey's lens framed her as both ordinary and extraordinary, collapsing the distance between the girl on the street and the icon on the page. And yet, behind the applause, Jean herself felt the unease of the storm she was creating. She wasn't chasing revolution, she was simply being herself. But herself was precisely what the industry had spent decades rejecting. Every runway that demanded statuesque perfection looked at Jean and recoiled. Every photograph that expected artificial grandeur instead found disarming reality. And that reality was spreading faster than anyone could stop. The young women of Britain began cutting their hair shorter, softening their makeup, walking with casual freedom instead of stiff elegance. Jean was no longer just a model, she was an influence, a catalyst. By 1963, international eyes had turned to her. American magazines wanted her. European editors debated her. Cultural critics tried to define her. Was she an accident, a passing phase, or the beginning of something irreversible? Even Jean didn't know, but one truth was becoming undeniable: she had broken through the first wall. The tremors of a generational earthquake were underway, and as Jean walked through the streets of London, chased by photographers and whispered about in smoky editorial rooms, the old guard began to realize their empire was no longer safe. A girl who looked like she could have been anyone's neighbor was dismantling the fantasy that had sustained fashion for a century. The battle lines were drawn. Jean Shrimpton was no longer just a Namesh, was the threat, the promise, the face of a coming storm. Jean Shrimpton's star was no longer confined to Britain. By 1964, her name had begun to echo across America as well. Young women felt an intimacy with her, and designers sensed a new freedom radiating from her image. Even the fashion capital of New York could not resist her pull. But the true turning point came not in London or New York, but in Australia. Melbourne's Victoria Derby horse race was one of the most glamorous social events of the era. It was bound by strict rules. Women were expected to wear hats, long dresses, and uphold a certain code of elegance. Into this tradition-steeped spectacle walked a 21-year-old Jean Shrimpton wearing a simple mini dress. She had no hat. Her arms were bare, and the hemline cut far above her knees. The crowd froze, some gasped in shock. Others muttered in outrage. Camera flashes exploded as if catching a criminal in the act. Yet Jean's intent was disarmingly simple. She had chosen the dress because of the heat. What she did not know was that she had just lit the fuse to one of fashion history's greatest explosions. The mini dress became a global symbol of freedom. Women were no longer hiding their bodies. They were reclaiming visibility on their own terms. The rigid codes dictated for decades by male-dominated society began to fracture with a single choice. Jean opened a new era not just for Australia, but for women everywhere. The press branded it a scandal. Critics called her disrespectful, immoral. But teenage girls were cutting out her photographs and pasting them into their diaries. They pressed their faces against shop windows, searching for dresses just like hers. Jean, without intending to, had become a cultural icon. Her ordinary, comfortable choices transformed into a generation's rebellion. From that moment on, fashion was no longer only about what elites dictated. It became something molded by the voices of the streets. When Jean returned to London, she was both hero and scapegoat. The fashion world was split. Some declared she had vulgarized the craft. Others hailed her as the embodiment of the future. The clash grew louder, with Jean unwillingly at its center. Yet Jean herself never wanted to set rules. To her, it was about ease and authenticity. Still, The spirit of the time shaped itself around her. People drew inspiration from her, mirrored themselves in her, and through her imagined their own futures. When she wore that mini dress, she may have only wanted relief from the heat. But for millions of women, it became the beginning of breaking chains. The press refused to leave her alone. Every outfit, every step, every expression became a headline. Shrimpton's new scandal. Jean defies the rules. The world's most dangerous model. Yet Jean remained quiet. She knew her popularity but felt uneasy with it. Still, that moment in Melbourne could not be erased. By 1965, the mini dress was no longer a passing fashion trend. It had become a cultural revolution. And Jean Shrimpton had become its face. She was not only redefining style, she was embodying freedom itself. She was the living proof that a woman could have sovereignty over her own body. And though Jean never sought the title, she had become the accidental heroine of a global transformation. Jean Shrimpton was no longer just a model. She had become a symbol of an entire era. But the brighter her star shone, the heavier the shadows around her grew. The photographs splashed across newspapers and magazines every day may have elevated her, but they also imprisoned her. To the public, she was the face of freedom, yet inside she felt anything but free. More often than not, she felt like an ornament placed in a shop window, admired but trapped. The fashion industry was changing rapidly, and Jean had been unwillingly positioned at the very center of that change. She reflected the ideals of a generation, but what she truly longed for was quiet and ordinary. By 1966, her career reached a pivotal moment. Time magazine named Jean Shrimpton the world's most photographed woman. On paper, it was an honor. In reality, it was a burden. Jean felt suffocated by the relentless attention. Every frame, every runway, every interview chipped away at her sense of self. She was no longer Jean, she was everyone else's projection. For the fashion world, she was a triumph. For herself, she was becoming a prisoner of her own success. Unlike other models of her generation who sought to capitalize on fame, Jean began to retreat. She turned down agency offers, distanced herself from photographers, and sought a quieter, more private existence. To her, the greatest value was preserving her identity. Ironically, she had created the blueprint for the modern supermodel, yet became the first to walk away from it. The press struggled to comprehend her choice. Headlines speculated about her disappearance. Why did Shrimpton quit at the top? Why did the world's most beautiful face turn away from the spotlight? The answer was simple. Jean had never wanted to be famous. She had only ever wanted to live life on her own terms. The cameras, the flashes, the catwalks, they drained her rather than fulfilled her. Yet even her withdrawal became another narrative for the industry to exploit. Fashion magazines began to romanticize her retreat, turning her rejection of fame into yet another marketable ideal. Jean, once again unwillingly, was shaping culture by simply being herself. Her personal life drew equal attention. Her relationship with photographer David Bailey, who had captured the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, and the very spirit of swinging London, was a cultural fixation. Together, they were the image of the 1960s, but even this love became exhausting. For Jean, nothing was private anymore. Every glance, every embrace, every silence was dissected. Jean felt deeply alienated. Though she was hailed as the most beautiful woman in the world, she carried a profound sense of loneliness. The spotlight that should have illuminated her only highlighted her solitude. For millions, she was a beacon of hope, but privately, she was searching for hope herself. Journalists pressed harder. Do you regret being the first to wear the mini dress? Why abandon the movement you created? Their questions became accusations. Jean's answers remained short, calm, and reserved. She had no interest in debates or legacies. She only wanted to be herself. And so Jean Shrimpton did what very few ever dared. She walked away while still at the top. That decision solidified her legacy. People remembered not just her beauty but her courage. In fashion history, her story was not just about inventing a new model of style, but about revealing the true cost of fame. At the height of her fame, Jean Shrimpton stood as one of the most iconic faces of the 1960s, but her story didn't follow the predictable arc of endless stardom. Unlike many who clung to the spotlight, Zhang chose something radically different. For her, true courage wasn't in shining brighter, it was in stepping away from the glare altogether. By the early 1970s, Shrimpton had left the chaos of London behind. She settled in Cornwall, where she began running the Abbey Hotel. For the public, it was a shocking move. Headlines marveled at the idea of the world's most photographed woman trading haute couture runways for hotel kitchens. For Zhang, though, it was liberation. Fame had never been her dream. What she craved was the quiet rhythm of a normal life. In rare interviews during this time, Zhang was always strikingly honest. Modeling was never her passion. It was a job, nothing more. The cultural weight assigned to her image clashed with who she truly was. The mini-dress revolution, the spirit of swinging London, the emblem of freedom, all of it belonged to society's imagination. Zhang herself felt distant from the myth that surrounded her. Life in Cornwall gave her what she had long sought. She worked in the garden, cooked meals in the hotel kitchen, and personally greeted guests. After years of relentless cameras and deafening applause, this quiet anonymity was a balm to her soul. Slowly, the press lost interest, and Zhang finally achieved what she valued most, being invisible to the world. Ironically, her retreat only made her legend grow. By walking away at the height of her power, she etched her name even deeper into fashion history. She had not only created the blueprint of the modern supermodel, but also pioneered the idea of rejecting the very system that built her. To future generations, her choice became its own form of inspiration. Models like Naomi Campbell, Kate Moss, and Claudia Schiffer would go on to sustain decades-long careers. Yet Jean's early exit remained an enduring mystery. Her story became one of beauty untouched by vanity, of fame resisted rather than embraced. Known in her time as the Shrimp, Zhang had broken every mold set before her. And with each passing decade, her influence grew larger. She had embodied the spirit of freedom for a generation, but she found her own freedom by leaving it all behind. Today, Jean Shrimpton is still remembered as one of the most unforgettable faces in fashion history. But her legacy isn't just about her beauty, it's about her defiance. She showed the world that walking away could be just as powerful as stepping onto the runway. For millions, she was a star. For herself, she was simply a woman searching for an ordinary life. And in the end, she found it.